Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so glad to be back with you tonight. Happy Women's History Month. Happy Adar. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's in the room with us. The chat box is also where you should add your questions, and I'll try to bring those into the conversation later on. A few words about JWA for anybody who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present, and we do all this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us make the world a better place. So thank you for being our partners in that. These book talks are just one piece of JWA's work. We have so much else going on. We hope that you will check out jwa.org to learn more about everything that we do and explore all the resources that we offer. A quick logistical note, if you would like closed captioning, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen that says CC or show captions, and that will turn them on for you. Okay, it is a real pleasure to introduce our featured author for tonight, who also happens to be an old friend of mine. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of Ikar, a Jewish community that launched in 2004 to reinvigorate Jewish practice and inspire people of faith to reclaim a soulful, justice-driven voice. Her book, The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World, which we'll be talking about tonight, is a national bestseller, and her 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1.5 million people. Rabbi Brous was named #1 on the Newsweek Daily Beast list of most influential rabbis in America and has been recognized by The Forward and Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Washington Post. She's a graduate of Columbia and was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Rabbi Brous comes to us tonight from LA, where she lives with her husband and children. Welcome. So very glad to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you, Judith. What a joy to be with you. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
So, you are a rabbi, you teach and preach all the time. You have to write sermons to meet the moment. You have to respond to things in kind of real time all the time. And a book is kind of a different project. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write the book and what your approach was?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say, first of all, the book launched January 9th. And so I've been doing these book talks for the last couple of months. And Judith, it's such a joy to do this with you and just be in conversation with you and with this beautiful extended community of folks. And so it really is such an honor. So, um, so the book is, I mean, it is interesting. It's very different to write a book than to write a sermon. The main difference is that I actually gave myself the time and the space to really dwell in an idea and to research and to read and to explore. And the book is just a tiny slice of what I uncovered and discovered during the course of that time. But it's really rooted in one idea that has been my North Star for the last 20 years. And I got to really look at every single aspect of it and kind of unpack its meaning in all different ways. And so that was really a great blessing. But I think your question, can you tell me, tell me
Well,
what?
I'm always interested in how people come to, we get to read these beautiful books, and the books that we cover at JWA are all so different and have so much wisdom. And this is such a wise book and brings together both like your rabbinic voice and all these stories from your community. And I was thinking about how, because I often listen to your sermons or read them and think just how, how incredible it is to be able to respond to things in the moment. And I was just thinking about how different a book project is. And I was just curious. I'm always curious about process, like how it is that people, manage to pull together the things that they have to say or the Torah that they have to teach and put it into this wonderful package for people. So I was curious for you, who is not, you're a regular writer of a certain kind, but not of books. I was curious what that was like.
Right. So I'll tell you, the book grew out of a sermon that I gave at Kol Nidre on Kol Nidre about 11 years ago. And it was a sermon that when I gave it, I knew I could feel in the room that it had this kind of transformative effect on the community. And then we witnessed over the next many years, I mean, the way the community changed, the dynamic of our relationships, the quality of our relationships changed after I gave this sermon. And then I would travel around the country and give talks in all different places. And I gave a version of that sermon in a couple of different places. And it was always the one that made people stick around the longest afterwards, wanting to
Mm.
talk, like lots of people and all different kinds of people, because it seemed like it was the idea that sort of stuck in, like stuck in, really touched the heart. And so I had, I mean, I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory since you're a process person, but about a decade ago, some literary agent from New York cold emailed me and basically just reached out saying, a friend shared a sermon that you wrote, and I think this would be a beautiful book. If you're ever ready to write a book, please call me. And I was like, delete, I don't have time for a book. I don't have time to breathe. And then he wrote back again 6 months later and said, this is another sermon that could be a book. Talk to me when you're ready, and deleted again. And he wrote to me basically every 6 months for almost 10 years. And um, at some
Persistence.
point,
I'm impressed.
it was really persistent. He was very persistent. And at one point I kind of got stuck in New York because I was held there for a couple of days. My travel extended, and I thought, all right, I'm just going to call that agent back. And I called him, and he said to me, listen, he said, I've been waiting for this call. I know you have an idea that's living inside of you. Tell me what it is. And so I just sat down and wrote like a bunch of paragraphs. And he said, and I sent it to him, and he said, this would be a good book, but actually the paragraph 8, that's what the whole book should be. That would
Mm.
be a phenomenal book. And so he took, and the one that he identified was that sermon. It was
Mm.
that Amen Effect sermon and I knew immediately that he was right, that it was like that given the opportunity to really do a deep dive into that idea, that I could actually, that, I mean, it really is in some ways the sermon of my life, that I could draw out so many of the things that I cared so deeply about, both in the moment and in this kind of evergreen way, through that idea. And it turns out, so the book was originally it was scheduled to come out at the end of September 2024.
Mm.
And my editor realized at some point 2 years ago, she said, oh my God, there's going to be this extremely contentious presidential election. No matter what happens, she said, nobody's going to be able to hear this like beautiful, delicate message. And like, we need people to be spacious when they receive this book. So can you finish it 10 months early, and we'll get it out in January 24, when things will be really quiet and people will be totally receptive to an idea about love and loss and connection and community. So I did. I finished it really early. We got it out. And of course, it lands right at one of the most challenging moments for us. And, as Jews and as Americans and as human beings. And so now I just think, okay, this is the message that is both evergreen and also exactly for this moment. And as I've been speaking about it on the book tour, I realized that even though I wrote it in a different world, I wrote it for this world that we're living in right now. Even though it's evergreen, it's very timely to this the particular challenges that we're experiencing in this moment. And so it feels both, it's a very hard time for a Jew to bring a book into the world. People aren't exactly excited to hear what Jews are thinking about these days.
Right.
And at the same time, it feels like there's a real hunger to figure out, how do we survive this moment that we're collectively experiencing. And if I can offer a little bit of wisdom and support through that, I feel like that will make it very much worth it.
Yeah, it feels like a really important guide for this moment. And I will say, I read the book first. You were so kind to send me a preview over the summer. I read it actually, I think, while I was sitting in the passport office trying to get my son's passport renewed. And then I read it again this week, and I cried at every chapter this week. And I was thinking about, like, why didn't I cry as much when I first read it? And part of it was probably that I was sitting mostly in a public place while I waited all day for the passport. But part of it was just like, my heart is broken in a different way now. And so some of what you were talking about, and you talk a lot about sort of grief, and the book is fundamentally about presence, how to stay present to people, just landed in a different kind of way. So I want to talk about, so thank you for that, first of all, but I want to get to this idea of what the Amen Effect is. And you have so many lovely ways that you talk about this question of sort of presence and the power of presence. You call it sacred companionship and bearing witness. And one of my favorites was the very holy work of not running away. but that is like being there for people in their big moments and their small moments. So tell us a little bit more about that idea and how you, where you saw it, how you developed that
Yeah,
concept.
great. So the central paradigm of the book is one particular ancient ritual from temple times. So really a 2,000-year-old ritual, which is articulated in a very terse Mishnah. Mishnah, ancient Jewish compendium of law, codified around 220 CE. So that also is an 1,800-year-old text talking about a ritual that happened, if it happened, several hundred years before that. And so this is the ritual. The ritual is that Jews used to go up for pilgrimage to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They would come from all across the land and from the diaspora. They would ascend to Jerusalem, a city on a hill. They would then climb the steps of the Temple Mount. They would enter through this beautiful entryway, and they would turn to the right in the courtyard of the Temple Mount, and they would circle all the way around the perimeter of the courtyard, and then they would exit essentially right where they had entered. And I have to say, when I was preparing, when I was researching for the book, I was really curious about what it must have felt like to be part of that pilgrimage, part of this sort of sacred mission. And I started reading firsthand accounts of Mecca and the Hajj. And people describe the pilgrimage to Mecca as this kind of transformative spiritual moment, because you wait your whole life for this opportunity. You plan, you save, you get there, and then you're just part of this mass of humanity that's circling there like we used to in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And there's an incredible kind of eternal power to it, even thinking about it. Like people describe in their testimonies, as soon as I arrived, I burst into tears, and then I cried the entire time I was there, and it felt like this ritual cleanse. And so the text says that everybody comes up, they enter to the right, they circle around counterclockwise, and then they exit, except it says for someone to whom something awful had happened, someone whose heart was broken. And those people would go up to Jerusalem. They would climb the steps of the Temple Mount. They would go through the same entryway, but they would turn to the left when everyone else turned to the right. And so they were literally walking against the grain, the way that so many people have come into my office over the course of many years. And I'm sure that there are therapists and other rabbis and other caregivers here who have similarly had people describe to them, it feels like the whole world is moving in one direction and I'm moving in the other.
Right.
And the rabbis describe that that's actually what this ritual was. The whole world's moving this way, the brokenhearted person's moving this way, and then the sacred encounter occurs, in which the people who are okay that day, who turn to the right, they look into the eyes of the person who comes from the left, and they ask a simple question, malach in Hebrew, which means, what happened to you? Tell me about your broken heart. Where's your sorrow? And that person who's coming from the left answers saying, Ani Avel, I am a mourner. My father died just before Rosh Hashanah this past year. And I'm in grief this year. And I'm trying to find a way to hold that grief in the midst of the collective grief our people are experiencing. Or they say, I just found a lump and I'm so scared. And I haven't even told my best friends. Or they say, I'm just so worried about my kid and I just need someone to tell me she's okay. Or they say, I just feel so alone in this world. Whatever they say, their broken heart is held tenderly by the community that moves in this direction. And then the people going this way bless them. And they say to the bereft and the bereaved and the ill and the brokenhearted, they say something like, may the Holy One who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult chapter. May you, as you go through the course of your treatment, know that you are not alone. May you continue to find strength every day as you hold your kid with your own broken heart. And that's it. That's the whole ritual. And then they keep going and then they leave. And I realized at some point when I re-encountered this text, because I first saw it when I was a seminary student, I came across it by accident. It's pretty obscure. It's a fairly obscure Mishnah. It's in the context of the architectural layout of the Temple Mount. It's not exactly riveting stuff, in my opinion. But I saw it by accident. And when I saw it in seminary, I knew something extraordinary was happening here, but I really didn't understand it. So I had the wherewithal to photocopy it and put it back in the book. And then I put it back on my shelf. And years later, after I had moved out to LA and we had built this community Ikar, after I had a bunch of kids, and I'd had a bunch of pregnancy losses. I had married a number of people, officiated at their weddings. I had officiated at a number of divorces. I'd buried a lot of people, named a lot of babies. I literally one day pulled the Mishnah out looking for something else again, and it came fluttering out. And I saw it and thought, oh my God, I know exactly what's happening. And
Mm,
what I realized was that none of the parties in this ritual wanted to be a part of this ritual.
mm,
That the person who's brokenhearted, the last thing in the world they want to do is even get out of bed, let alone, get dressed and climb a lot of steps and show up in a place where there are hundreds of thousands of people and they're all moving in the opposite direction and show their vulnerability to the world. That's just not a human instinct.
right. And
And
fight
yet,
against the crowd. It feels hard.
exactly, it's hard. It is hard. And we actually, I'll tell you, we enacted the ritual at Ikar,
Mm,
and it was incredible. And it was hard. I'm walking to the left right now because of my father. And it felt hard. I mean, it was hard to be that vulnerable and hope that the person coming toward you is going to see you. So it's the last thing you want to do. And yet you're not allowed to stay home. And you're not allowed to show up but turn to the right and pretend you're like everyone else, because you're not, because you're broken. And when you're broken, you need to trust that you can be vulnerable and you will be held with love. And the people who are going this way, who the last thing in the world they want to do is peel away from their friends and their family and see some brokenhearted stranger who's coming toward them and engage them and ask them, tell me about you and your broken heart. And yet that's exactly what they're called to do. It's such a powerful ritual that says exactly at the moment that you most want to retreat from each other, you have to show up for each other in your pain, in your brokenness, in your vulnerability, and with your love at exactly the moment that you don't want to share your love in that direction, because someone else's vulnerability makes you feel vulnerable, because you feel like that pain is contagious, that divorce is contagious, that traumatic death that they've experienced is contagious. And this says, you know what you have to do? You have to show up anyway. You
mhm.
have to show up and say amen to someone else's pain. That is the most fundamental human call. And that is the greatest gift that we can give to each other. And so that Mishnah, that circling, because it's also such a beautiful image. And someone told me the other day that in Reiki that the counterclockwise circle is what we do to release the toxins from the system, which I love, because the rabbis were on some level, they were relating to that. Like, how do we get rid of the toxins when we walk to the left and let somebody walk in a counterclockwise direction and actually release some of some of what we're holding inside of us?
Mm,
So the book really explores in all 8 chapters different dimensions of what it means to actually show up in that sacred circle. And chapters 1 through 7 are really looking at the intimate, the interpersonal, the communal, and looking at how we hold the brokenhearted and how we step forward when our hearts are broken. And then in the 8th chapter, the question shifts from the brokenhearted to the other character, who I reveal at the end of the book, is also included in the Mishnah, who's not the Avel, the brokenhearted person. It's the mourner, but I'm extrapolating to mean the brokenhearted, but actually the ostracized, the
yeah.
person who might not be coming toward you, but coming at you. And
Mhm.
how do we receive somebody whose views or perspectives or behavior has actually hurt us and we see them coming toward us? Can we open our heart to them too? And should we? Where are the boundaries and the limits of what we can and should do? So that's essentially the way that the book, that's the question that the book offers, with, I hope, some guidance on how we can both answer those questions and also figure out how to implement those dynamics in our own lives through some very real practical spiritual practices.
Yeah. One of the things that it reminded me of, just the whole idea of the communal acknowledgement and the power of that, which doesn't have to do with holding brokenheartedness exactly, but has to do with the partner piece of it, which is also just how it lifts in general. It's actually one of my favorite stories from all the material we have at JWA is a piece by Marcia Falk, the liturgist and poet who um, wrote for our feminism exhibit about the first time she publicly shared uh, blessings that she had written in the feminine form, and how scary it was, and how nervous she was to admit that she had changed the traditional words and that she was
Mm.
experimenting in this way. And she said this happened at in the early 80s at a Chavra institute. And she said she got up in this room and said these blessings, and the community said amen. And
Oh,
that in doing that, it made what she had done real, and it gave some kind of support and took away her fear, and instead empowered her to go on with the kind of work that she'd been doing. So it just rang that bell for me of just what it is to have communal acknowledgement and to be seen, for whatever you're doing, whatever, whatever feels hard or scary or new or different or maybe not okay in the, in a communal context, and the power that we have as a community to be able to affirm somebody both in times of trouble, but also just in times of any kind of insecurity.
yeah, I love that story so much. Thank you for sharing that. And I mean, the way that I'm thinking about this and really what drove the book in many ways is that we're living at a time of intersecting crises. One of the most dominant of those crises is the loneliness epidemic, and which the Surgeon General has been talking about as a massive public health crisis. And we know that it's not only hurting our spirits, but it's hurting our bodies, that there's a physical cost to loneliness. And we know that it also threatens our democracy. And I speak about Hannah Arendt in the 8th chapter when she says that tyranny cannot take root in a society in which people are proximate to each other. But when we're alienated from each other, when we're isolated, when we're lonely from each other, that gives the space for totalitarianism to thrive. And so it feels, and we are in that crisis moment. We know, I mean, I cite this in the book, but before COVID, there was a study that came out that said that 1 in 3 Americans does not know the names of their next door neighbors. We
Mhm.
don't know each other and we don't trust each other. And that kind of fracturing, those ruptures are only growing exponentially in the course of the last couple of months. And so what we're doing is we're creating a landscape in which our spirits are broken, our bodies are broken, and our democracy is threatened. And we are least able to muster the strength to respond to it all. And so it feels like this great imperative and an urgent imperative to actually turn toward each other exactly when we're instinctively we instinctively want to retreat, and to do it not only in sorrow but also in celebration and also in solidarity. And I talk a lot about joy in the book and what it means to to make sure that we show up for the simcha, as my
Mhm.
grandma Millie used to say, like not to pull away from each other in times of joy. And they're also good. I talked about the reasons why we pull away from sorrow because it makes us feel so vulnerable. We have lots of reasons why we don't celebrate with each other too.
Right.
And and some of them are understandable. And even still, my grandma used to say, because she catastrophized a little bit, it's because it's like in the family line.
Right.
But she used to say, if God forbid there was a tragedy and you would fly in for the funeral, you better get there for the bat mitzvah. And we grew up this way, and I really took that seriously. Like you have to celebrate the most beautiful, like the big moments and the small moments in between with each other. This is the stuff of life. And I realized at some point that we can't take for granted either part of that, either that people will show up for the wedding or that they'll show up for the funeral. And so, like, rule number 1 from the book is just show up. The
Right.
first chapter is called show up, and the rule, the spiritual practice at the end for chapter 1 is go to the funeral. You never ever regret going to the funeral. It takes a lot of time out of your day. It takes a lot of rescheduling and reworking, and you miss appointments, but you never regret being present for a person who's grieving and hearing them share stories about their loved one. And
Yeah.
this is a really a gift that we can give for each to one another, or a gift of our presence. And I remember, I mean, my father's funeral, there was a moment when in the funeral, it was such a blur. I can't really remember much about what happened inside the chapel. And then we went out to the graveside, and there was this moment when my mother, we all placed earth on his coffin, which I tried, like, I really encourage people to do with our own hands and not with shovels.
Mm.
And the family goes first, and we all place the earth. And then my mom didn't want to move away. Usually, like, the direct mourners move under the tent and, get a little bit of shade. And it was 103 degrees out and in Simi Valley, but my mom didn't want to leave him. And so, we ran and got a chair for her, and she just sat right by the graveside. And then we all, like, nobody said a word, but we all just sat down right by the graveside, right at the edge of the grave. And we were just singing together. And at some point, I looked up and I saw that there were literally hundreds of people who had schlepped like an hour or two out to Simi Valley in the 103-degree weather to bury my father with their bare hands.
Right.
And I just, like, I was completely floored by this. And I just saw, like, staff members and former staff members who I haven't seen in years, and old friends from college who I didn't even know they were in LA, and there they were. And I just thought, like, what better gift could anyone ever give me than them helping me bury my father right now? And it was so powerful. And then a couple days later at Shiva, our friend Greg flew in from New York City for 6 hours. He
Mm.
flew to Los Angeles just to be at Shiva. And then he got on a plane and flew home because he had to be at work the next day. And I just thought, like, and I'm like, don't come, don't come. That's crazy. And then as soon as I saw him there, I thought, my God, like, that's what love is on some level. Not
Totally.
to say we should always fly across the country. And it's not great for our carbon footprint, but it was great for our hearts. It
Yeah.
was great for giving us the sense that we were really loved. And it's something I'll remember for the rest of my life. So that's the power of us showing up for the
Mhm.
joy and showing up for the pain, just being there for the stuff of life.
Yeah, I've often said to my kids, because often Shiva, conflicts with they're not necessarily around when I'm going to funerals, but in the evening when I go to Shiva Minion, sometimes they're like, "Oh, this is inconvenient." I'm always like, "You will never regret showing up for Shiva." But I'm going to now share also your grandma Millie's point that, like, you need to show up for the good things too. And I think one of the things that you talk about really beautifully in the book is the fact that you want to show up for the grief and for the joy. And sometimes those two things are happening at the same time in community. And it is really complicated to figure out how you hold space for grief and for joy simultaneously. And that resonates really right now, just in general, and also because it's Adar and we're sort of, in this month, we're supposed to be increasing joy. And I feel like it's really hard to know what that means right now. Um, Talk a little bit about that, sort of, and you bring a couple of stories in the book about lessons from the period of the destruction of the temple about how to think about holding grief and joy at the same time. What did those stories show you?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, this is exactly the question that we're struggling with right now, and we have a series of house parties that we're doing at Ikar leading up to Purim, and we sat down to talk about what we wanted to teach. Each of our rabbis does, and it does one in each of the different neighborhoods. And it was so clear to me, we have to talk about how do you hold joy and pain in one heart? Because everybody's asking this question. And, I think instinctively, many of us would sort of call off Purim this year. Like,
Right.
we would say, it just doesn't feel right to have like revelry in the midst of a horrible war where, the terrible atrocities that that were committed against our people. And then the just like striking, horrific human suffering that's happening in Gaza, and just the starvation and the loss. I mean, it's too much for the spirit to hold.
Too
And can we
much.
do
Yeah.
that and also hold joy? Can we even hold that much joy and pain in one heart? So the story that I tell, there's a whole chapter dedicated to this in the book, as you said, and it really starts when there was a small boy in our community, this beautiful little boy who died very tragically in a freak accident that happened just before, it was Rosh Chodesh Elul when he died, just a month before Rosh Hashanah. We marked his 5th birthday in Shiva. It
Mm.
was a horrible loss for the community. And I was with the family and at the Shiva after the funeral, and just unthinkable tragedy. And they said, we're going to come on Shabbat so we can say Kaddish. And I thought, okay, that we'll do what community does, which is hold space for grief. We do that, actually. We know how to do that. But then I realized that we had this bar mitzvah scheduled for that Shabbat. And it was, this kid was such a joy and such a wonder. and he'd been working so hard. And, as I write in the book, like, this was truly a kid who reveled in learning Haftarah. And like, he just could not wait to get in front of the community and, and offer his offering and then be lifted in a chair. It was like the great dream of his life. And I just thought, oh my God, how are we going to do that? How are we going to hold that much pain and that much joy all at once? And I turned to the wisdom of our tradition, and looked at two stories, both of them written in the Talmud around the similar period, post destruction. And one of them is the very famous story that we learn when in Bava Batra, when many Jews, survivors of the catastrophe of the destruction of the temple, which is like only roughly equivalent to the catastrophe of the Holocaust in terms of how many people it touched and how massive the loss was. And so there were among the survivors, even a couple of generations later, there were people who decided they couldn't enjoy life anymore. They couldn't eat meat, they couldn't drink wine. And they just decided, like, only through kind of denying themselves those things did they feel that they were kind of spiritually in sync with their family, with their people. And Rabbi Yoshua comes to them and basically says, look, if you're going to deny yourselves meat and wine, you also really shouldn't eat bread, because we used to bring bread offerings before the temple. You also shouldn't even eat fruit. And eventually you shouldn't even drink water, because we brought water libations. And realizing, like, sort of pointing them to the absurdity of withholding joy from their lives because of the great sadness of this catastrophic loss. And eventually he teaches them, and he teaches us, no, the way that we do this is we are always present to the loss. We're always holding the memory of the loss, but we live because we're alive, because we are called to live. So he says, so you have your celebration, but you leave a little bit out of the celebration. You make your feast, but leave out one delicacy. You put on your makeup and your jewelry, but leave one little piece off. And that way you'll always remember that this picture holds brokenness at its heart. And so I speak about that. I speak about the ritual of broken glass. So one thing is, like, you grieve and you live and you grieve. Jews celebrate wholeheartedly under the chuppah, but with the sound of shattered glass. It's kind of astonishing if you really think about it. Like, I know you feel so full right now because you're in love with this person, and this person's in love with you, and all the people who love you most are there because they show up for the simcha. But we're going to break a glass
Right.
to remind you how terrible the world can be also. And what we're doing is we're saying you're part of a human community that is both full of joy and also full of pain. And don't distance yourself from that pain ever. And so what we ultimately learn is that joy is not an escape from the pain of life, that we experience joy as an expression of our awareness of the fragility of life, of the vast human suffering. We are never dissociating from the suffering. We're only experiencing a kind of depth of joy that honors and recognizes how fragile life is and how much pain there actually is in the world too. And I think all the time about Rabbi Alan Liu, who has this incredible teaching about joy in his extraordinary book, This Is Real and You're Completely Unprepared. And he says, joy isn't about fun. Joy is about the deepest release of the soul. And that includes an awareness of death and pain. And so he says, joy is about letting yourself live fully in it. And what we ended up doing at Nico's bar mitzvah, that terrible Shabbat that came right on the heels of Giddy's death, is we said Mourner's Kaddish, and the whole community was like experiencing reverberative, not just sadness, but trauma. And the family wept, and we were fully present for them. And Nico read his Haftarah, and we danced, and we lifted him up in a chair. And I literally thought, Judith, are the walls of this gym, like, are they going to collapse on us? Because there's so much joy and there's so much pain in this room. And are our hearts going to collapse? But they didn't. The walls of the gym stood tall. We daven in the gym, and the wall, and like, our hearts can hold it. They can. And I actually, like, I speak to many different moments in that chapter when I have held a full grief and full joy at the same time. And I've realized that that's when I've experienced the fullness of life the
Right.
most, is when I'm so aware of the fragility and I'm not compartmentalizing my sadness and the utter anguish and despair and grief of what's going on right now in Israel and in Gaza is going to be very present for us when we come to Purim, and we're going to celebrate because our bodies need to experience that joy and our spirits need to experience joy so that we can continue to do the work of building a more just world. And so our challenge is actually, can we allow ourselves to live in the place of that much pain and that much celebration all at once?
Yeah. And I think it, as you're saying, it pushes us to understand joy differently. Like I was talking about the challenge of this month actually with my daughter, who was saying like, well, is Adara kind of toxic positivity? And we were kind of talking about this and I was thinking about it and but I think actually what it's calling us to do is to recognize that like joy isn't some Instagram filter that's like, happy, everything's good, right? It's actually acknowledging that there can be beautiful things that are also messy and that are also difficult with that the two are inextricably linked, and that we don't have to have some kind of fake joy that is all 100% shiny and sparkly, that it can be um, you know, a burnished joy that's a little bit different. And the Purim story actually holds that for us, right? Because it's a
Right.
story that's about uncertainty and it's about, you know, being saved by the skin of your teeth, and it's about how hard that is and how scary that is. And that's exactly why you need to be
Yeah.
joyful, because you can't count on that to be what's always the moment that you're in.
That's right. I think that both Purim and Yom Kippur are rooted in the same fundamental truth, which is life is precious and precarious, and you could be dead tomorrow. So how are you going to live? And Purim, of course, is this great celebration of joy. Yom Kippur is called in the Mishnah the most joyous day of the year,
Right.
right? Like joy is attached to a recognition of our vulnerability. And so I want us to live into a joy that is not a disconnect from reality, but
Mhm.
rather it's precisely because we're so aware of the reality. And one of the stories that I share in that chapter is about my cousins, and my cousin Lizzie was this beautiful, incredible young woman, and she was 52, and she was dying from colon cancer, and her younger sister got engaged, and all she wanted was to live to the wedding. She just wanted to live to see her beautiful sister's dream of love fulfilled. And she did make it to the wedding, and she was really frail and really weak. And we just sat at this wedding under the chuppah on the rooftop of a New York City apartment, and it was, we just witnessed her presence there. And then we all the cousins went over to basically say goodbye to her, and we knew it was the last time we were ever going to see her. And then her husband took her home, and then we literally circled up and had a shot of tequila, and like it was a wedding. We had to dance because Nancy got married, and we danced that night. I've never danced like that in my life. I mean,
Mm.
we were all hysterically crying the whole night and dancing for 4 or 5 hours. It was like the most powerful experience of human presence. And and we just had to do it that way. And by the way, Lizzie's sons stayed for the rest of the wedding, and they danced with us. Her
Mm.
sons danced and the cousins danced, like the siblings, like we had to be in joy and we had to be in grief at once. We didn't have the privilege. And I love that Yehuda Amichai poem. He has
I
this
was just about
incredible
to
poem.
mention that one.
Like,
Yeah.
we don't have time. He says, Kohelet was wrong. Ecclesiastes was wrong. We don't have a time for living and a time for dying. We don't have the luxury. Every time is a time for dancing and a time for weeping. That's just part of the sacred mix of life. And I just want to say, if we are present and if we are awake, there's always joy and pain in the same room at the same time.
Right.
Somebody just found out that they were pregnant, and somebody else just lost a friend, and someone else just is falling in love, and someone else just got broken up with. Like, it's all happening. We just don't know about it. And so this is just raising our awareness and our sensitivity to the vastness of the human experience that's always before us.
Yeah. And I think that, I love the way that you talk about it and present it both on the collective and on an individual level, because you're talking about sort of what's happening communally, but also all of that is reflected in each person's experience. And you talk about what it means to show up for other people and also what it means to show up for yourself, and to try to, what the relationship is to being present in general and being present to what your own purpose is in the world, and trying to discern that, and how that comes out organically when you are actually in community and connected and showing up for other people.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, this is something that so many of our traditions speak about, and Judaism certainly does. But I've encountered so many people who are like, I'm so lost. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what I'm put into the world to do. And people go seek their purpose, either by isolating themselves from community, or, or sort of disengaging so that they can do the work of trying to understand themselves. And my spiritual practice for this chapter, for chapter 4, is start by serving. Just wake up and say, like, what's one thing I can do for another human being today
Mm-hmm.
that just might be my purpose in the world, like might be the way that I can actually, we don't even necessarily know. And I write in that chapter about angels, and about how angels in Judaism are, our understanding of them is that they're brought to the world to serve one purpose, and
Mm.
they may not know what their purpose is either. And what if we're like them? What if we have some sacred purpose that we're called into, that we don't even necessarily know how to discern? um how do we find it? And my
Yeah.
answer is by stepping into it. And if in the paradigm of the Temple Mount, it's like, because we walk with our eyes up to see who's coming toward us, and then who we can ask simply, tell me about you. Malach, tell me about your pain, about your brokenness. And that kind of presence may be exactly what we were put into the world to do. And then, I realized at some point one year that what the angel says to Hagar, when Hagar is cast out from Abraham and Sarah's home, in Sarah's like fit of rage, when she's cast out of the home and she puts down Ishmael, and she's just weeping and saying, we're all gonna, we're both gonna die. And an angel comes to Hagar, it says in Breshit, and the angel says to her, Malach, Hagar.
Mm.
Malach, the same word. What happened to you, Hagar? Tell me about your heart. The same exact words that we're called to say to each other in that ritual. And then I realized what the Hebrew word for angel is, which is malach. And like we're called to embody the work of angels by turning to each other with love and saying, tell me about your heart. And could it be that that's exactly what we were put into the world to do? And that's how we find our purpose in the world, by
Right.
being that present for each other.
Yeah, that's beautiful. When I was reading, I saw when you're talking about malach, and I'm thinking, oh, like the word for angel. And then I turn the page, I'm like, oh yeah, there you are. You got that.
It's funny. I didn't realize it for years, and I told you this Mishnah has been my kind of North Star for 2 decades. And then a couple years ago, when I was giving a sermon about angels, and as I was preparing it, I realized, oh my God, oh my God. And yes, it is
It's
spelled
spelled
differently.
differently.
That's right.
Yes.
But the rabbis play all the time with the way words sound. And it doesn't matter that it's spelled differently, because they were very aware of
Mhm.
that, of that linguistic kind of resonance. And so I spoke about it in a sermon on Kol Nidre. I mentioned that connection. And I remember that people went like this, like when I said mala, I said, and what is the Hebrew word for angel, malach? And people were like, oh my God. And because it's so incredible, like there's something sacred that's happening
Yeah.
here. And it's really pulling us toward one another. And and I went, there's a story in here that that I was thinking about just as we were starting. One of the angel stories that I share about, this really, I have this incredible board member. The book is full of like little stories, all true, about people I've encountered in my life, and a lot of people in the community who very generously, said that I could share these stories. And there's incredible Torah in these stories. And one of the stories is about one of my beautiful board members and dear friends, and she went out for a run one Friday afternoon before Shabbos, and she got hit by a drunk driver as she was running, and her body like flew in the air, and she survived. she survived the crash, but we did not know if she would make it, and we didn't know in what condition she would make it. I mean, literally, her body was she was destroyed by this, and she at some point in the ICU, she started to like come to, and she would, we were all kind of holding vigil there, and she was like sort of regaining consciousness, but in and out. And she very mysteriously, as soon as she could speak, started saying, Andrew, where's Andrew? Where's Andrew? And, we were like, who's Andrew? And her husband's name's Jeremy. So and Jeremy was
A
saying
little
to me,
awkward.
he's like, I don't know. All I want is for my wife to live. I don't know who Andrew is, but like, little weird, little weird. I don't know what the story is. And like, they couldn't figure out what was going on, but she kept asking for Andrew, asking for Andrew. And then she started regaining more of her consciousness, and then regaining more of the use of her body. And she is, thank God, like fully intact now. I mean, the doctors were incredible. She's truly a medical miracle. She has astonishing will. It is, I mean, it's incredible that she survived, but we did not find out until a long time after who Andrew was. And the way that we found out was because she finally saw the police report, and she discovered that when she got hit, there was another runner who was going in the other direction, who happened to be out at that same moment at that same intersection, and he witnessed this happen. And he literally ran. He saw her body go through the air, and he saw the drunk driver drive away.
Hmm.
And he ran after the driver, and he said, stop, you have to take responsibility for what you've done, and you have to call 911. We need help. Then he ran back to her body on the street, and he held her in his arms, and she was totally unconscious. And he spoke to her, and he said to her, my name is Andrew. I am staying with you. I will not leave you. You will not be alone. Help is on its way.
Hmm.
And somehow it entered her like subconscious.
That's amazing.
And as I write in the book, like, I don't know this guy. She didn't know this guy. I have no idea if this guy has any sense that
Right.
he saved her life that day. But I think he was the help that was on its way. Like, of course, it took some time for the paramedics got there. The doctors were amazing, all the love of the community, all the prayers from around the world. But like, this guy saved her life. He held her broken body in his arms and said, I'm not leaving you. And so I think that, like, if you think about angels coming to this world with one single mission in their lives, like, I'm pretty sure that was Andrew's,
Yeah.
And so, like, I think the way that we figure out our mission is by living with our eyes up, and
Mhm.
casting our gaze toward those who are coming toward us, who need us to be with them, and to, to offer that kind of comfort and support, whether, whatever, in whatever form it takes.
So you reference the fact that the last chapter of the book is about it's basically about staying connected with people who are very distant from us, who are kind of across a chasm from us, and who are not only distant but possibly dangerous. And you talk about the fact that even people who've been ostracized, and I found this really surprising, even people who've been ostracized are also included in this pilgrimage
Yeah.
ritual. And you talk very beautifully about the possibility, and you give lots of great examples of the possibility for change that happens when you encounter somebody, even across this kind of major divide. And obviously, this is something that's been a pressing issue for many years, but I think is particularly resonant right now in this very heated atmosphere post October 7th that we're living in. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that paradigm today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this occupies 90% of my time right now, just thinking about this and working on this issue. Um, so the ostracized person is, in Hebrew, it's called the menudah, and this is a person who, in word or deed, has actually caused so much harm that we're not to really engage them. It's one step short of excommunication, and they're ostracized in the hopes that something might change, like that we're separated from them so that they might realize it. We don't have them over for Shabbos dinner. They don't count in a minyan. You're supposed to literally socially distance from them 6 feet, it says,
Mhm.
Dalit. Okay, but they're there. And just like you, I mean, I was completely blown away as I dove into this, because like, it's shocking that they're even in the same room, because they have done so much damage. Note that the excommunicated are not in that room. They're not there, because the people who've caused harm to that level, in other words, this is calling us to distinguish between who makes us unsafe and who makes us uncomfortable.
Mm.
And the people who make us unsafe are not in the space. Someone who would blow up the Temple Mount is not allowed into the Temple Mount. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So these are people who have done things that have really hurt us. Anything short of like making us unsafe, they're there. And we see them and we ask them, tell me what you see from your vantage point. I'm going this way, you're coming this way. We're seeing the world differently right now. What do you see? And then they tell us, I'm a person who's been ostracized, which means back then, because they probably had a totally perfect criminal justice system and they would never ostracize someone who didn't deserve it. Like, I've actually done some things that have hurt people significantly. And even still, they're given a blessing. And the rabbis argue about which blessing they're given. But the point that matters most to me is they're blessed.
They're
Right?
there.
We
Yeah.
find a way they're there. We see them. We ask them, tell me what you see. Tell me about your sorrow. And then we bless them.
Mhm.
So the idea of this chapter, and I think that really the most important message I could offer for this moment is, can we be curious about each other? Can we be curious? And what happens when our hearts are broken? Because I was speaking with a psychologist friend a couple months ago, and she said, you can't really most people can't access empathy if they don't have social safety.
Mhm.
And so if we are we're in anguish and grief, we are holding great fear for the day to day and for the future, and we're totally traumatized because what we've experienced has brought on our multi-generational trauma is fully present. Are we in a position where we could be curious about others, where we could experience empathy toward others? And my answer to that is not everyone all the time.
Right.
Right? Not all of us are able to experience that kind of curiosity right now, to kind of muster that curiosity, but some of us can. And so we should. And some of those people who are coming not toward us, but at us are in our own families, right? And it's critical that we're able to look at them as human beings who are also experiencing pain and sorrow and who see the world differently from us. And what do we lose when we stay at the table and hold curiosity instead of running away? And I myself, I have had a few experiences in the last couple of months, as I'm sure we all have, in which the language that was being used by another person was so painful for me that I literally just wanted to leave the room. I wanted to get the hell out of there. And I thought, I was away from home. I thought, I just want to go home and be with my kids. I don't want to be here anymore. I had this total fight or flight reaction. I'm like, I don't want to fight. I just want to get out of here. And I thought, the best I can do right now is just stay here and try to hold curiosity about why this person's using this kind of language, and give them the grace of my human curiosity right now, and hope that they might do the same for me one day, knowing that they might not, but knowing that I don't want to be defined by other people's limitations. I have enough limitations to define myself. I don't need to be defined by someone else's. And so I really try to stay at the table. The chapter's called Wonder, because, like, could we hold wonder for another? And and one of the stories there, if I can just share one
Yeah.
little piece. This is an incredible story that is about one of my congregants named Hannah, who grew up gay and Orthodox, and her family's in Jerusalem. And she and her wife went to Jerusalem for a bat mitzvah, because you go to the simcha, you show up. And they got there just before the Pride Parade in Jerusalem a couple of years ago. And so they were, of course, very excited to go to the Pride Parade, which has a special resonance for many of us in Jerusalem. Like, the Pride Parade in Tel Aviv is incredible. The Pride Parade in Jerusalem, it feels like really something historic and monumental. And they went, and they were 10 feet away from a 16-year-old girl named Shira Banki, when a Jewish religious extremist who had just been released from prison that morning after serving, because 10 years earlier he had tried to stab someone at the Pride Parade in Jerusalem. He got out of prison, he went to the Pride Parade, he took out a knife, and he stabbed this young girl named Shira Banki, and he killed her. And my congregants and friends were just 10 feet away when it happened. They witnessed this murder up front, and they were completely devastated by what they had experienced and totally shaken. And so they went to the Shabbat dinner the next night for the bat mitzvah. And seated across from them at the table was this guy who Hannah had known for many, many years, kind of grew up with him. And he had become an extremist. He really got hard over those years. And he had this kind of rap sheet for acts of vandalism and violence against liberals, lefties, against Palestinians. He was really extreme, and he was ranting about how outraged he was about the Pride Parade, not about the murder, but about the Pride Parade desecrating the streets of Jerusalem. And Hannah's thinking, like, how can I even be in the room with this person? The way that I think many of us can relate to that feeling when we hear voices like that, or whatever the trigger voice is for us. But as she sat there, she started to just get curious about him. Like, does he really believe this stuff? And what happened to this guy? Like, he was a nice guy when we were growing up. Like, how did he become so hard? And so she just stayed at the table, and at the end of the meal, she clinked her glass and she offered a toast. She never said a word to him, but she offered a toast to the bat mitzvah girl and said, like, you're living in a time and a place where it really matters that you remember that Torah is about love and justice. And I hope you live that way, because we need your voice and we need your open heart and your beauty and whatever. So a few days after the bat mitzvah, this guy called Hannah's family, and he said, I'm upside down. I don't know what to do. He said, I sat across the table from a lesbian the whole Shabbos dinner. And I thought to myself, would I have wanted something terrible to happen to her? And I thought, of course not. She's just a person. And he said, I don't know what to do now. And literally, he shows up at the Pride Parade 2 years later wearing like a rainbow kippah and holding a sign that says love wins. And I mean, Hannah says to me, all that I accomplished was not getting up from the table. It was just sitting there and holding curiosity. And so I closed the manuscript, and several months passed, and the Pride Parade in Jerusalem happened this past year. And Hannah called me up and she said, oh my God, open the paper. She said, that's the guy. And literally, her guy is the face of the Pride Parade, the rainbow kippah, the love wins, one kid on his shoulders holding a trans flag, one kid in a stroller, and like his whole life changed
Yeah.
because she stayed at the table. So could we
Right.
stay at the table and hold curiosity and hold some wonder too? Is that possible?
Yeah, it's an amazing challenge. And also to think about it again, sort of when someone else can't, can we step in for that person? I
Right.
was in Israel in January, and was overcome by awareness of how much trauma many Israelis are in right now, and unable to be, paying attention to what's happening in Gaza, and don't have the space right now to do that, and they're focusing on their own trauma, and they said that, and I left feeling like, okay, so that means that those of us who are not in that level of trauma have an added responsibility to be paying attention
Yes,
for the things that they
yes,
can't be paying attention to, and
yes.
we can share that, right? We can step in for each other in that kind of way. This is such a beautiful book, Sharon. I am really just
Yeah.
so thrilled that it's out there in the world, and it is such a gift to get to talk to you about it. And I hope that everyone is going to buy it and read it. I wish we could talk for longer. There's many more things I would love to ask you about and talk about further. So we'll find another time. But mostly I just want to thank you for this really beautiful book and for this conversation. And I want to thank everybody who is in the room with us tonight for being here. As always, there is more to discover at JWA. One thing we didn't get to talk about is actually like all my questions about gender and women in the rabbinate, and there's lots at JWA that you can read about that. You can actually see some video clips from an oral history with Rabbi Brous that is in our Women Rabbis collection, which is created in partnership with the Story Archive of Women Rabbis, and you can explore our whole collection there of 76 rabbis and learn more about women in the rabbinate around the world and all the amazing work that they're doing. And you can read an article in our encyclopedia about women rabbis. We'll also put in the chat the link to the piece by Marcia Falk that I mentioned earlier. And I happened to find on our site, and we'll put this in there just for fun also. I found this blog post that I wrote about you, Sharon, 12 years ago when you were being honored by the Auburn Theological Seminary. I had forgotten I'd
Wow.
even written that. So we'll pop that in there too. Please join us next Thursday, same time, same place, for a conversation with Tanir Oxman and Nancy K. Miller about their book, Feminists Reclaim Mentorship. Hope to see everyone there. And we're also going to be having a special virtual program on Tuesday, April 16th called Let's Talk Gen Z Jewish Feminism, featuring 4 alums of our Teen Rising Voices Fellowship. Some of you know we're celebrating 10 years of the fellowship this year, and I will say that working with these young leaders is really the most hopeful part of my job. So I hope that people will join us for that program as well. And the registration link's in the chat, and we'll include it in our follow-up email tomorrow too. So until next time, wishing everybody a good week. And again, thank you very much, Sharon, and take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judith. Thanks, everyone.